right. Now I want to match up my material in some pairs that make sense to me. And the criteria that I'm using to join these is finding fabrics that are have a similar width to them so that I'm not having to cut too much off. And when I find them, I will pin them together along the edge that I plan to sew, because that's going to remind me where to square them up in just a minute. I think these two are sort of close in their color and in the amount of sort of likeness and darkness of the material, so I'm not going to sew those together. I like to have a little bit of contrast in my fabrics when I'm creating a seam. It's sort of the idea that if I put a lot of work into making the seam, I want it to be noticeable. And even though it's tempting to cut off these selvages, I think they add a little bit of interest. And a selvage is the edge of the fabric that's created during the manufacturing process. And sometimes the selvage is woven a little bit tighter than the rest of the material, or sometimes it's a little bulkier. But on this material, it feels rather consistent all the way to the edge. So I'm going to keep that. I think it'll be a fun visual element. And I'll try to keep it in several places. When you do something just once, it might look like an accident, but if you do it multiple times, then it's definitely a design choice, as they say. So let's see. I think I'm just going to leave those and save them for other pieces. And even though I like the idea of joining these two long pieces, I prefer to stitch all the way across with just one strand of thread without stopping in the middle to knot off and begin again. So that influences sometimes the length of my seams. On a big project, I do need to knot off in the middle, especially when I'm joining other smaller pieces of patchwork. But as we get started today, I think I'll take these scraps and make them into two that I can use. All right, so I have designated the edge of the material that I'm going to be stitching. And now I want to square up each side. As I square up these scraps, I'm keeping an eye towards the texture of the material. Fabric is woven with thread that travels on an x-axis and a y-axis, and we call that the straight of grain. So when you cut along the straight of grain, the fabric maintains its structure. But if you were to cut on the bias, if you were to cut diagonally, the edge that's created is not as strong. It has a little bit of give to it. So when I'm doing patchwork, I try as often as possible to keep an eye to the natural layout of the material and not sort of cut diagonally into it. And I'm going to leave this little fuzzy end here. I'm not sure if I'll use that later on or leave it exposed, but some of these threads are going to bother me. So I will snip them off right now. All right, after I have my two straight edges, I will put the clip back in place. And I'll have them nicely lined up. And that's just my mental cue that reminds me these are squared up. I kind of work in big batches sometimes. And so when they're lined up like this, I know that the edges are straight and they are ready to be prepared for sewing. And I'm going to take off this little bit of scraggly over here. This one's pretty straight. I probably could have used it as it was, but it never hurts to clean up the edge. And I just have one left. I find that it's nice to set up a couple of batches of these before sitting down in a comfortable chair with an audiobook or a movie and a cup of tea or a glass of wine. All right, now I have 4 practice pieces. Let's go to the iron.